Welcome and thank you for coming. This is part of the semi-quincentennial lectures that are happening, events that are happening across campus as part of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I am Deborah Fisher, and I'm the director of the John Seigenthaler Chair of First Amendment Studies in the College of Media and Entertainment. And as part of that, I bring speakers in for the college and for the university as a whole, as well as manage the First Amendment Encyclopedia online, which has lots of entries in it and lots of updated entries in it. If you're interested in that, please visit the First Amendment Encyclopedia. It's easy to find. MTSU has been running it for several years now. I am very pleased today to have Sue Humphrey here. Carol is a professor emerita of history from Oklahoma Baptist University, where she taught for 35 years, and is the author of several books on American history and journalism. She's been a member of the American Journalism Historians Association since 1986, serving for years as its secretary. She earned a bachelor's degree in history from UNC, a master's in American history from Wake Forest University, and a doctorate in American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is an expert on the press of the American Revolution and in the early decades of the Republic, as well as the War of 1812 and the New England press in early American history. Her books include The American Revolution in the Press, The Promise of Independence, which was her last book, published in 2013, and which she will be talking mainly about today. She also researched and wrote The Press of the Young Republic, which covers the years of 1783 to 1833, focusing on these 50 years after the Revolution, during which the American press expanded and became very involved in partisanship that characterized most of this period. She's written the Revolutionary Era, primary documents on events from 1776 to 1800, This Popular Engine, New England newspapers during the American Revolution. But suffice to say, she has a lot of information about the American press before, during, and after the Revolution. And that's what she's going to talk about today, and talk about how the Patriot press, as sometimes it's called, played a role in the Revolution and played a role in bringing together colonists during this period. So I'm very pleased, and you can just take the mic, Carol, Sue, and I will take a seat, and we will have Q&A afterward. So thank you for coming, Carol.
Okay, thank you for having me. Okay, I will warn you, I'm a little old school, so I'm just basically going to read what I'm going to talk about, so just be aware of that. Okay. The American Revolution had a major impact on newspapers. Newspapers had been around for a long time in the colonies, but the Revolution gave them new functions to fulfill. As the 13 colonies slowly dissolved their ties with Great Britain, newspapers played an increasingly important role in the growing dispute. Both Patriot and Loyalist writers used the weekly newspapers to attempt to convince their neutral countrymen to support their side. The Patriots were more successful, so much so that by the time the Revolution had begun, pro-British newspapers had disappeared from most colonies. It was in the conflict over the Stamp Act that newspapers discovered a new role to play. The Stamp Act, passed by the British Parliament March 22nd, 1765, was to become effective November 1st, 1765. It was aimed at raising revenue to help Britain pay off its war debts. The act required that all legal documents, official papers, books, and newspapers be printed on stamped paper that carried a special tax. It placed an additional tax on advertisements. This portended immediate disaster to printers, requiring that taxes be paid at the rate of a half-penny per half sheet, a penny for larger page sizes, and 2 shillings for each advertisement. The income that printers received at the time from subscribers and advertisers was only slightly greater than the taxes. Striking as hard as it did at printers, the tax gave them a special reason to use their newspapers to oppose the Stamp Act. Although at first indecisive, they shortly began to stiffen their resolve in the face of what they saw as tyranny. The press war against the Stamp Act began in Boston. Awakened to the dangers building against them, printers there took to their job cases to argue against the act as a frontal attack on the liberty of the people in general and the freedom of the press in particular. As the deadline approached, printers debated what to do. Some temporarily suspended publication, while others came out defiantly as usual, appearing without the detestable stamp and declaring that the Stamp Act was a direct attack on liberty itself. Some printers also claimed that they continued publishing because of threats from Americans who wanted them to continue to protest the Stamp Act. In late October, several newspapers published with black borders and a skull at the top to protest the impact of the Stamp Act. The most garish design was in the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. It published in the funereal black columns of a tombstone topped with skull and crossbones, mourning over the death of press liberty. Whatever the course pursued by printers, it is notable that not a single newspaper published on stamped paper. In March 1766, Parliament, recognizing that the Stamp Act was unenforceable, repealed it. By then, colonial newspapers already had been inspired to oppose British authority. Their continuing opposition helped lead Americans to the Revolution. Francis Hopkinson, signer of the Declaration of Independence and a member of the Continental Congress, believed the press was vital to Patriot victory in the Revolution. But he argued that newspapers had to be silenced if they did not support the move for independence. He explained, when this privilege is manifestly abused and the press becomes an engine for sowing the most dangerous dissensions, for spreading false alarms and undermining the very foundations of government, ought not that government, upon the plain principles of self-preservation, to silence by its own authority such a daring violator of its peace, and tear from its bosom the serpent that would sting it to death? Like Hopkinson, patriots and British officials believed authorities were justified in silencing outrageous speech. Typical of such thinking, a special Patriot Commission in Newport, Rhode Island, determined that freedom of the press required liberal sentiments, but did not allow wrong sentiments. With a foundation in such thinking, press freedom depended on the issues and circumstances and the degree of clout that patriots and Tories had. It was permitted for some, but not all. The Revolutionary period thus created a conflict in terms of modern thinking on freedom of the press. Whereas the modern press is expected to be fair and impartial, a mission admittedly it sometimes fails to perform, patriots and Tories believed that if a newspaper was not wholly for their side, it was against them. As a result, as the patriots gained strength, the greatest danger to press freedom came not from British authorities, but from patriot mobs and from threats by groups such as the Sons of Liberty. Zealous revolutionaries muffled many voices from New Hampshire to Georgia. The radical patriots were many and formidable, and they meant business. Personal rights that we take for granted today were secondary to the goal of colonial independence. The patriot press of the Revolutionary period is best understood as an organ for promoting ideology. Before the war, printers intensified their propaganda efforts against Britain, but escaped prosecution because of popular opposition to British authority. Grand juries made up of colonials would not indict offending printers, and authorities feared that more high-handed or extra-legal measures would invite violent opposition. The government grew increasingly lax in restricting printers. Having set the precedent during the Stamp Act crisis, authorities discovered they had more and more difficulty reining in insolent printers afterward. They faced the dilemma of wanting to punish offenders while fearing the result if they attempted to do so. Isaiah Thomas, proprietor of the Massachusetts Spy, was one of many printers who flouted authorities because of their quandary. Summoned before the governor's council for essays critical of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, he snubbed the council's messenger and ignored the order to appear. The council then voted to prosecute him for seditious libel, to which Thomas, joined by a chorus of writers and other papers, responded with trenchant attacks on those officials who would regard freedom of the press so lightly and attempt to punish someone for printing the truth. The council persisted in pursuing the case, presenting charges to a grand jury 3 months later. The jury refused to indict Thomas. The council believed the jury had been packed, but decided to drop the case. One essayist in The Spy then gibed at Governor Hutchinson, "No writer needs now to stand in fear of you." Ideologies are most forceful when convinced that they are right. Patriot printers were no exception. They believed zealously that they had advocated justice and that truth was on their side. Those who opposed them supported injustice and were backed only by error and deceit. Such an outlook made necessary a selective use of material in Patriot newspapers, for publishing material opposed to truth did nothing to advance liberty and justice. John Holt of the New York Journal wrote, "My paper is sacred to the cause of truth and justice, and I have preferred the pieces that, in my opinion, are the most necessary to the support of that cause, rather than those that were barefaced attempts to deceive and impose upon the ignorant." To do otherwise, patriots argued, to print both sides would give support to those ideas and practices damaging to mankind and liberty. Using such reasoning, printers devoted their papers wholeheartedly to colonial freedom and, eventually, separation from Britain. With the coming of the Revolution itself, they did not stop in encouraging the war effort. Concerted opposition to the British had begun with the Stamp Act. The newspaper's success in helping to get the act repealed emboldened printers to defy British authorities and showed that the press could be used as an effective propaganda tool. The press, therefore, came to be regarded as a strong arm of the Patriot movement, and several writers and printers gained widespread recognition. With the calm that had settled in following the repeal of the Stamp Act, colonial unrest might not have gotten out of hand if the British Treasury's need for revenue had gone away, but the problem remained. To solve it, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, devised a plan to place duties on goods imported into the colonies. In a series of letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of the British colonies, John Dickinson attacked the taxes on the grounds that they were not for regulation of trade, but for raising revenue through external taxes, which Parliament did not have the power to do. These letters were published first in the Pennsylvania Chronicle in 1767 and 1768. They were really sound in argument, reasonable in tone, and clear and forceful in style. They were not urging independence from Great Britain, and indeed Dickinson clearly opposed separation at that time. The letters were, however, important in the move toward independence because of their influence in prompting the merchant and business class to question British policy. Boston Patriots were the most industrious in the colonies in promoting independence, and to that end, they produced a widely circulated Journal of Occurrences. Published from late 1768 through the first half of 1769, it detailed Boston's suffering under the Townshend Acts and British military rule. Newspapers throughout the colonies picked up items from it, resulting in the publication of Boston Patriots' views throughout the land. The most aggressive writer was Samuel Adams. He was a leader of the Radical Caucus Club. The members of the Caucus Club were committed to independence and through their writing for the Boston Gazette and other activities exercised a strong leadership in political action in the colonies. It was said that America's course was determined by Massachusetts, that Massachusetts' course was determined by Boston, and that Boston's was determined by Samuel Adams. It was Adams who, because of his Gazette writing and his talent for propaganda, did more than anyone else to promote colonial independence from Britain as a practical, realistic action. The Gazette was the chief radical newspaper in the colonies, and its owners, Benjamin Eads and John Gill, were the most strident critics of the British prior to the Revolution. When the Tea Act of 1773 brought the issue of British trade monopoly to a boil, Eads was one of a number of Bostonians who guarded the wharves to prevent the opposition from landing at the now hated tea. On December 16, 1773, a group of radicals joined Eads at his home. There they discussed the tea issue, drank considerably from a China punch bowl, and at dark went to the Gazette office nearby. Others who had attended another meeting at Old South Church met them, and all donned Indian disguises. They then proceeded to Boston Harbor, where they boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea overboard. Frustrated, the hapless Boston Tories railed against them. As one of them wrote, "The last Eads and Gill's newspaper is a torrent of envious calumny, dirtily poured forth from a sink of meanness and defamation." Another complained that the foul-mouthed trumpeters of sedition, Eads and Gill, bellow and rave and drivel like mad dogs and clumsy cur dogs under a dying man's window. So Eads and Gill clearly were having a big impact. They actually provided the cutting edge for much of the revolutionary movement. But what's interesting is they dissolved their partnership in 1775, and it's not real clear why that happened. But that's on the eve of the revolution, and they broke apart. Later, they will each attempt a paper on their own, but neither one of them are as successful as the Gazette had been, and they will actually both die in poverty after the war. Whereas Eads and Gill's Boston Gazette was the leading radical newspaper before the American Revolution, Isaiah Thomas's Massachusetts Spy was the most incendiary publication during the Revolution. Prior to the war, Thomas had been outspoken in his support for independence. He revived the join or die, divide a snake device that Benjamin Franklin had created in 1754. And he never softened his attacks on British trampling of colonial rights and liberties. Accounts such as his reporting of the Battle of Lexington in 1775 were designed to stir up the anger of colonials. That account began with this call for action. "Americans, forever bear in mind the Battle of Lexington, where British troops, unmolested and unprovoked, wantonly and in a most inhuman manner, fired upon and killed a number of our countrymen, then robbed, ransacked, and burned their houses. Nor could the tears of defenseless women, some of whom were in the pains of childbirth, the cries of helpless babies, nor the prayers of age, confined to beds of sickness, appease their thirst for blood, or divert them from their design of murder and robbery." More important than any single writer, however, were the Patriots' committees of correspondence. These committees were created to distribute information and ideas among towns and colonies and to newspapers. The impetus for the establishment of standing committees devoted to the Patriot cause came in 1772. In the wake of the attempts by Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson to insulate the courts from colonial influence, Samuel Adams issued a call for standing committees to be set up to resist the action. A Boston town meeting in November appointed a standing committee, and Patriots in other towns and colonies soon followed. They eventually established more than 80 committees of correspondence. Each circulated letters to other committees and provided propaganda to newspapers. In that way, through informal organization, they succeeded in their goals of keeping the colonies informed of events, issues, and opinions, and stirring up antagonism to British efforts to suppress colonial opponents. During the years of actual fighting, the press played a vital role as it provided information about the war to the people. More than any other institution, the press encouraged the people to support the war effort. Thus, newspapers became the primary morale boosters throughout the Revolutionary era. Printers such as Benjamin Eads and Isaiah Thomas used a variety of means to lift public confidence in the drive for independence. Throughout the war, essays and news stories emphasized the tyranny and corruption of the British and the glory and justness of the American cause. Patriot newspapers sought to destroy any remaining colonial ties to Great Britain. Describing George III as the whining king of Great Britain, the press urged Americans to discard all loyalty to the mother country. Accusations of cruelty and barbarity by the British and their Tory supporters filled newspapers. In 1781, for example, several printers accused Lord Charles Cornwallis, the general in charge of the British Army, of trying to spread smallpox in the South. This plot, a writer declared, must render him contemptible in the eyes of every civilized nation, it being a practice inconsistent with the law of nations and as repugnant to humanity. Even more important for morale than attacks on the British were discussions of American successes and future prospects. Printers filled their pages with material on the justness of the American cause and the success of the Continental Army in battle. There was no doubt that the United States would be victorious, for as one newspaper writer averred, it is allowed on all hands that the American Army is now equal at least to any in the world for discipline, activity, and bravery. There are no soldiers in Europe more exemplary for subordination, regularity of conduct, patience in fatigues and hardships, perseverance in service, and intrepidity in danger. Newspapers worked to increase public resolve by urging all readers to put the war above all other concerns. In 1776, Isaiah Thomas proposed, "Let us not busy ourselves now about our private internal affairs, but with the utmost care and caution, attend to the grand American controversy and assist her in her earnest struggle in support of her natural rights and freedom." Similar sentiments appeared throughout the war. According to revolutionary printers, such efforts would produce final victory. Through such discussions, the press sought to help achieve victory by assuring that American morale remained high throughout the armed conflict. Concern about the content of news stories was commonplace during the Revolution, and the Patriots were a prayer that press freedom had implications for public opinion. If a free press were designed to create a well-informed citizenry, then the people had to be kept appraised of what was going on in Congress and on the battlefield. This belief was best illustrated as a worried George Washington encouraged the creation of camp newspapers for soldiers to read, and as he sent old tinting to be made into paper for civilian newspaper use. For its part, the Continental Congress showed its awareness of the importance of information by creating a postal system that permitted the free exchange of newspapers. During the war, printers filled their newspapers with stories and essays about the fighting. While obviously seeking to keep readers informed, they also hoped to keep them concerned as well. Newspaper efforts to encourage support and involvement and to boost morale went on for years, for the war proved to be a long one. As it came to a close, Benjamin Franklin praised newspapers for their usefulness, for he explained, "By the press we can speak to nations, and we now find that it is not only right to strike while the iron is hot, but that it may be very practicable to heat it by continually striking." This the Patriot newspapers had clearly done through both defeat and victory by their nonstop discussion of the war. One of the most intriguing questions about the revolutionary press is what influence it may have had. What role did newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and other printed forms have on the initiation and execution of the revolution? Most people at the time believed that the press exercised a major influence. Printers, Patriot spokesmen, and government authorities clearly thought the press was important. Otherwise, they would not have placed so much emphasis on it. Washington and other Patriot leaders went to great lengths to aid it. Writers and printers used it to express their views to attempt to sway public opinion, and British authorities tried to suppress it. As early as the mid-1760s, the view was widespread that newspapers were playing a central role in affecting public opinion. A writer in the Providence Gazette in 1766, commenting on newspaper success in opposing the Stamp Act, expressed that view. "The press," he declared, "hath never done greater service since its first invention." David Ramsay, a patriot who participated in revolutionary activities and then wrote the earliest history of the war, concluded that the press was among the most important ingredients in bringing about the revolution. He wrote, "The exertions of the army would have been insufficient to effect revolution unless the great body of the people had been prepared for it, and also kept a constant disposition to oppose Great Britain. In establishing American independence, the pen and the press had a merit equal to that of the sword." The number of such comments by contemporaries could be multiplied indefinitely. They make clear the conclusion of people who lived during the period. The press was indispensable in affecting public sentiment leading to the revolution. Thus, it is clear that newspapers filled an important role during the war. They constituted the primary sources of information about the conflict. Although reports were not always accurate, printers hoped they would boost morale by helping to maintain interest in and support for the war effort. By publishing accounts from throughout the colonies, the newspapers helped foster a sense of unity and solidarity of purpose that was essential for a successful revolt. The fortunes of both Patriot and Tory newspapers depended on which army controlled the towns in which they published. Several printers had to flee hurriedly as the opposing army approached. Those who did not move quickly enough had their presses confiscated. Typical was the plight of John Holt of the New York Journal or General Advertiser. The British forced him to leave New York City and chased him about Connecticut for several months. Finally, he set up a printing shop in Kingston, New York, where he printed a newspaper for less than 4 months. The British Army caught up, burned Kingston, and destroyed part of his materials. He then fled to Poughkeepsie, where he managed to publish a paper with repeated military interruptions until the end of the Revolution. William Bradford III, Patriot printer of Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Journal, had similar experiences. Although he was 57 years old at the onset of the Revolution, he served in the Army while continuing to publish the journal. He suspended it while fighting with the Army in the campaign around Trenton in December 1776 to January 1777, and again from September 1777 to June 1778 when the British occupied Philadelphia. When the Army left the city, Bradford again resumed publication, but the rigors of his military service had left his health and business ruined. As if military dangers were not enough, Tory printers faced the added threats from Patriot mobs and governing bodies. Although James Johnston of the Georgia Gazette was loyalist in sympathy, even after the shots fired at Lexington in 1775, he was able by his impartiality to continue the paper into the following year. At that time, the Georgia Council of Safety forced it to suspend. When the British Army occupied Savannah, Johnston resumed publication and was able to continue for 3 years. At the end of the war, however, Patriots declared him a traitor and forced him to leave Savannah. Benjamin Towne provides another typical Tory story. At first, he placed his Pennsylvania Evening Post on the Patriot side and succeeded in driving his Tory competitor out of Philadelphia through his constant criticism. And he was the first newspaper publisher to print the Declaration of Independence in 1776. When the British took Philadelphia, although several other printers fled, he stayed and ingratiated himself to British officers by changing his politics. When the British Army evacuated the city, the other Tory printers fled, but again Towne stayed, changed his politics, and was allowed to continue his paper, although he was unable to win back his earlier circulation and was ostracized by Patriots. For all papers, the war added difficulties to a news gathering system that was not sophisticated, to say the least. Neither newspapers nor British or Patriot leaders provided for anything approaching organized coverage of the revolution. Newspapers relied for their information on the chance arrival of private letters, official messages, and other newspapers. Each paper printed some local information that others picked up, but even that information was paltry, and reports of major events sometimes consisted of no more than a paragraph. While such a system during peacetime functioned reasonably well for colonial purposes, it was by later standards crude at best, and war added difficulties. News was tardy. The Postal Service, which barely had developed beyond its infancy, was hampered by the interference of military campaigns, poor financing, and bad roads that stayed in disrepair. English papers, which had been a prime source of news before the war, were received irregularly. As a result, news of major events sometimes was delayed a month or more. Americans were ill-equipped with information, and rumors and false news abounded. One of the Patriots' press's biggest problems was shortages of supplies, especially newsprint. As a reaction to the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, colonials had agreed not to import certain items from Britain, giving Americans the impetus to begin manufacturing presses and type. Paper mills also multiplied in number. But even though 60 or more existed in the colonies at the time of the Revolution, paper shortages caused the press much trouble. Paper prices went up sharply, mainly because of the scarcity of rags needed in paper making. The threat that the shortage might mean a cessation or at least a substantial diminution of newspaper publishing worried Patriot leaders. Newspapers carried pleas for saving rags, and Patriot organizations and town meetings gave prizes to women who showed the greatest patriotism by saving the most rags. Even George Washington took time from his military duties to urge women to save the smallest scraps as a patriotic duty. Although not telling the whole story, the figures on newspaper mortality reveal something of the effect of the Revolution. At the beginning of the war, 37 newspapers were publishing in the colonies. 17 of those died during the war, leaving 20 publishing at its end. 33 new papers were started. Of those, 18 died and 15 survived. Thus, at the end of the war, 35 newspapers were publishing, 2 fewer than at the beginning. While a difference of 2 may seem of little importance, it does not indicate the magnitude of the war's effect. At one time or another, 70 papers were being published during the Revolution. Only half survived. Such a high death rate during a period of 7 years illustrates the hazards war posed for publishing. The most important impact of the Revolution on the press, however, lay in the change the War of Independence brought to America. Freedom had been gained from the mother country. A new political philosophy took firm root, and the foundation was laid on which would be built a wholly new governmental system. While the American press had been instrumental in helping bring about the Revolutionary War, the war thrust the nation and its newspapers into an independence that soon would result in another revolution in politics and government. And for a second time, the press would play a critical role in helping shape the American nation in the 1790s and even after that. Thank you.
Okay, I want to open it up for questions. Anybody want to start? No? Amy? Okay.
Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I was especially struck by your point about how the newspapers helped create national solidarity throughout the war. Because, of course, militarily, we're going to celebrate Evacuation Day tomorrow, and the British evacuate Boston, very, very early.
Yeah.
Did that Boston press focus as much or talk as much about as the military campaigns moved into New York and Philadelphia and then into the South? Or did it peter off a little bit when when New England was not the focus? Because, of course, there's a strong state or colonial identity amongst the colonists and Americans at that time.
It probably was a little less, I think, but they still covered it. It's just that it wouldn't have been as quickly because it would take a while for the news to get there. But the Boston papers really did do a good job of covering what was happening in the Revolution.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. How did the newspapers reach readers? In other words, what were the literacy rates like, and how did people get the news? I mean, I assume all these people weren't, quote, subscribers, and that's not exactly how it worked.
Well, some people subscribed and read it at home. But one thing that was really common in this era is that the local taverns would subscribe, and because the papers were weekly, and when they got the latest edition, someone would sit in the tavern and read it out loud, and a lot of people would come so they could sit and listen and hear it. And it's just really, reading about that is just kind of an interesting kind, okay, that's a way to do it, but it still got the news out, which is what they were trying to do.
Thank you for your speech and everything. This has been really, really cool information. Thank you. With revolutionary press in the Revolutionary War, and then later seeing like aspects of like the Black press through like civil rights movement and all of that, where do you think revolutionary press stands in the United States today as like a piece of American legacy and everything?
Well, I think one thing is that I think it's the Revolutionary era press that really got people to understand the impacts that newspapers could have or media could have, because it was newspapers then. It's, you know, today we've got several varieties. And it just really, it made people really want to know what was going on, and they knew that was the source, the way they could find out. And so I think it's very important in the sense of establishing that as a regular way of finding out what's going on. And so, and, you know, I think from then on, everybody just turns to whatever media exists to find out what's going on. So.
Would you talk a little bit more about the reporting process? You really talk about snippets of information, but for an audience here that's used to instant information, I mean, even your comment about reading the news in the tavern.
Yeah.
Gosh, context. There's no Associated Press, there's no inverted pyramid, there's no telegraph. How do the snippets come?
Usually what happened is that printers would exchange papers with each other. And so somebody, like, for example, in the southern colonies, they got a lot of the Boston newspapers, and they would just pick stories up from there and reprint them, which meant it would take quite a while for people to get it, because, you know, it could take weeks for a paper from Massachusetts to reach North or South Carolina. And so, you know, our sense of timely news is very different than what it was during this era, because it just, I mean, you know, it could take a month to find something out, even in the American colonies. Now, if you're talking about it coming from Europe, it took even longer sometimes, because it just, you know, how long could it take to get the paper across the ocean?
So, follow-up question. How much, as a historian, and I know you've looked back at particular newspaper issues, how much distortion would you find if you compared the original Boston story to a reprint or version of it printed in a Savannah newspaper? You mentioned that they would lift it, but at the same time, was there a little spin put on it locally or distortion in the message?
Sometimes, but not all the time. A lot of times what they did is just print exactly what they found, which is, I mean, it surprised me when I realized that, because I'm like, oh, I figured they would tweak it a lot, but they didn't very much. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there were some inaccuracies. Is that they were doing the best they could do and they just made mistakes, or were they slanting stories?
I think most of the time they were just doing the best they could. Now, there's really no way to be 100% accurate one way or the other. So I'm sure some of, I mean, I think Samuel Adams would tweak it, definitely. So I think that did happen some, but I don't think it was a real conscious thing to do.
So you mentioned how during the Revolution, we didn't exactly believe in freedom of the press. We believed in freedom of the press for patriots.
Yeah.
We often see, or I often see, the Alien Acts of 1798 as something of an anomaly. But in some ways, it sounds like that might have been a kind of continuation of what we had during the Revolution. Were there any other famous cases you can think of between the Zinger case and then sort of the attacks by Madison and Jefferson on the Sedition Act that would be important for us to know about?
No, I think the attacks on the Sedition Act are the first one that really kind of does it. Yeah.
Thanks.
And just as background, would you remind everybody of the Zinger case, because that gets lost sometimes?
I never did do much about that, so you go ahead.
Well, right. Basically, the Zinger case was a case that preceded the American Revolution in the state of New York. And there was a newspaper articles that were very critical of the governor. And when it went to a jury, the jury decided that they would accept if the information were negative, but it were truthful, you could not be accused of libel. So they basically said, yeah, we have a rotten governor.
Yeah.
The information is true. We're not going to send
Yeah.
him to jail. That's the condensed version.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and I'm just fascinated, that George Washington encouraged there to be camp newspapers as the
Yes.
Continental Army moved throughout the war. Did those survive? And if so, did they include anything sort of beyond the orders of the day? Did it capture sort of camp life or what the soldiers were experiencing, or was it
Yeah.
meant to boost morale? I'm just fascinated with what
Yeah.
the content of
I
those
think it
sort of
was
camp newspapers.
I think it was primarily designed to boost morale and to keep them engaged. I don't think, now, I think there are some of them that have survived, but not very many of them. But I think the goal was to try to just keep the Army together. And that Washington just saw this as a way to do that. So,
I think there was a question back here.
Yeah, you stated that media sources did their best at that time to state unbiased opinions in their literature. So, given today's way of media being more focused on entertainment, algorithm, popularity to be seen, what lessons could be applied for current journalists that, as we potentially head to another war, we're able to kind of take some of what we've done in the past to what we're doing in the future?
I think what I would say is probably the thing to do is just the focus should be keeping people informed of what is going on. And yeah, during the revolution, they were very one-sided. And so they were biased in ways that I don't think I would be real comfortable with today. But one of the things to remember that I think impacts that is the fact that it did take so long for stories to spread. I think that's one of the reasons we need to focus more on trying not to be real biased, is because we find out immediately or very quickly. Because, it just doesn't take that long for stories for us to get from one place to another. Whereas back during the Revolution, well, and really until the late 19th century, it took quite a while.
Do you think that the reporting during the Revolutionary War has shaped Americans' thoughts on how we see King George? Or do you think it was accurate to who the character he was?
A little of both. Because I think it was all real negative. He just got hammered a lot. Now, it's not that I think George was this really great guy, but probably not as bad as the press portrayed him. So, because one of the things too, again, to remember, the fact that we're talking England and America across the Atlantic Ocean, that just, on a lot of levels, they don't really know each other because of the distance. And that can create a lot of issues a lot of times.
Thinking about the Patriot Press, would you say that they influenced opinion or changed opinion of the colonist more, or just reflected what was already there?
Depends on who you're talking about, because some people, obviously Samuel Adams had already made up his mind, some others, but I think there are also some who hadn't decided, but the press convinces them this is the way we need to go. And so I think it does have an influence on some people. I just don't think it necessarily influences everybody, because I think there are a lot of people who've already made up their minds.
Was the press independent from government during this period, from their local?
Somewhat, yeah, because I mean, there were a lot of local papers that made money from the government, because they printed stuff for the government. But the government doesn't really totally control them. So they are somewhat independent.
Any more? Back of the back?
I don't know. Oh, the mic is on. Okay, great. So you were speaking about how Britain was consistently trying to interfere with patriotic press, and of course, many printers were very persistent. Do you know how printers were distributing newspapers while tensions with Britain were increasing?
How they were distributing them?
Yes.
Just the traditional ways. People who subscribed to them, or they tried to make sure they delivered them to them. So I think that you have some. I mean, obviously the loyalist printers suffer a lot and get kicked out. There were actually 4 loyalist printers in Boston that fled when the British Army left in 1776 because they just knew they couldn't stay. But there were also, I think by and large, they are trying to, get things out. I think that the Patriot printers obviously are able to do a better job because they're not being punished as much, or tried to shut them up, so.
Does that kind of get at your question?
It does. I didn't expect you to know in full detail because it was such a long time ago, but that does explain better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If they interfered, you were wondering if perhaps they were interfered with in terms of distributing
Yeah.
their pamphlets.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything about that in general. Now, again, the loyalist printers in particular, really, that most of them have to shut down because they can't really get everything out. But the Patriot printers pretty much aren't having any troubles unless they are having to deal with the British Army at times. So,
Any other questions? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned that, only really Patriot newspapers would get printed. What was the motivation for journalists to pursue it at that time? Was it particularly lucrative for those journalists to go into newspapers, or was it more of, I feel really strongly about this topic and I want to distribute that to more people?
Probably a combination. I mean, there were people, a lot of the printers had been doing it for years, and so they wanted to stay in business. But I think there are some who decide, okay, we need to get this out and the people need to hear it, so we need to figure out a way to get the word out, so we'll print something. And one of the things, Samuel Adams had been interested in the press, but he only really gets involved in it once the revolutionary stuff starts up. So.
I know you mentioned that a lot of them became casualties of war. I want to go a little bit deeper into that. Are they all casualties of war just because of the war's damaging things like people dying off and things of that nature, or is it more so the news was merging so much that they kind of became one entity?
And maybe Carol, repeat the question so it's on the mic.
Okay. Okay. You're wanting to know if, okay.
So you're asking about the newspapers that died. So many newspapers went out of business during the war, and you want to know, what was the second part?
All casualties of war were just the fact that they died in battle and things of that nature.
Oh, if people were,
merging together, trying to come together.
oh, okay.
Okay.
So if people, I guess, running the newspapers were killed, is that what you're saying in battle?
Yeah.
Or did the newspaper, why did the newspapers die during the war?
Basically, most of the newspapers that died were because they were seen as the enemy. And so they just kind of shut down. Most of the printers, I don't really know of hardly any printers that actually fought in the war. And so I don't think they got killed off like that. Now, I'm sure there were a few that, got caught in a battle because it was happening in their town or something, and so they may have gotten hurt that way. But I think most of them, the print papers that die do so because they just, one, they're in an area where they just can't operate because they're against the majority of the people, or they just, can't afford it anymore. Because I mentioned Eads and Gill, both of them, going broke. A lot of that had to do with the fact that they just can't make enough money anymore. So.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the role of pamphlets in the Revolutionary War?
Well, pamphlets were used primarily to, spread a smaller idea, or a specific idea. They weren't really, they were printed somewhat, but they weren't a regular printing kind of thing like a newspaper was. Your newspaper was every week. Pamphlets were just used to get something out. Usually it was more than could fit in a newspaper. So they, it's not that pamphlets are really long, but it was more, newspapers, remember, are just basically 4 pages at this time. The front and back of two, one big piece of paper about like this, and you fold it in half, and that was it. Well, pamphlets would be more than that, usually. And so they were printed for that purpose, I think. But they're trying to get an idea out, or something out that they think will help convince the people to let's go do this.
Were they read out loud too? Especially like
so.
Common Sense?
Yeah, I think some of them were, yeah. I mean, I haven't necessarily seen anything specifically referring to any particular one, but I think they were.
With the majority of papers being Patriot-based during the Revolutionary War, at what point did you see the reintroduction of accountability journalism towards the American government?
Okay. What do you mean? Explain a little bit more what you mean.
So,
Could you speak into the microphone?
So the majority of the surviving papers were Patriot-based after
Right.
the war. At what point did the press begin criticizing the American government again after the war?
There was a little bit during the 1790s. You can actually find some criticism of Washington as president because he does some things people didn't like. But the press doesn't really take off in what I would describe as a political kind of thing until the 1820s or 30s. So, because that's when, if you look at the history of political parties, that's when they really start to take off. So I think that's kind of when that starts to happen.
Okay, good. All right, any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
Was the press ever threatened in any way beyond like legally? Sorry, I'm trying to think of an example of what I'm trying to say. But like beyond like legally, like, seditious libel and everything, like was there any sabotage to the printing or the press or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. Some of the loyalist printers had their equipment destroyed. So, yeah, it did happen some. I don't really remember running across any references to that happening to Patriot printers, but if they were in a city that the British controlled, it could have. And so I think that, but yeah, that was one of the ways, because mobs went crazy during this era. I mean, we know about the Boston Tea Party, but there were a lot of other things that happened that we don't really know as much about.
Papers were quite influential during the debates over the ratification of the U.S. Constitution.
Yes.
And of course, the Federalist Papers,
Yes.
good example of this. They were originally essays published in New York newspapers.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of anti-Federalist papers as well.
Yeah.
I think that's it. Nobody else? Okay. Oh, she wants a follow-up.
I was just wondering what you think if the patriotic press hadn't existed or was a lot less popular. Do you think the American Revolution would have turned out the same way?
Probably, but I'm not 100% sure, because I think the newspapers, the Patriot papers, were really important about keeping people involved and firing them up. And so Well, and to me, one of the best examples of this is all that Washington did. I mean, the fact that he urged women to save rags and stuff. He knows it's important. It knows it needs to happen, and so I think that I don't know that it would have changed things in a big way, but I think it would have changed things. You know, there's a day when I think, well, maybe the revolution would have lasted some longer because of getting people involved. So
That is a good last question. Thank you. And thank you, Carol, for a great, informative history of
you.
our early American press. Thank you, and thanks for everybody coming, and happy semi-quincentennial.